Picture this. You are standing beneath the high stone arcades of St. Peter's Basilica just as the afternoon sun fades, casting long shadows across the cobblestones. The scent of incense still lingers from morning mass. 100 feet above, the dome gleams gold, a beacon of spiritual authority. But just beneath your feet lies a different world, one carved in darkness and sealed with silence. There, in the deepest veins of the Vatican, corridors of cold stone snake away from the light, and in those sealed chambers, something precious was hidden, not relics or manuscripts, but boys. If you find yourself drawn to stories that peel away the marble veneer of history to reveal the vulnerable lives buried beneath, consider subscribing and let us know where in the world you're watching from. These truths are difficult, but together we honor what was silenced. By the late 17th century, the Vatican had become a self-contained world of ritual, power, and control. Rome itself still bore the fractures of the Counter-Reformation. The Church had survived theological schism, crushed political rivals, and cleansed public heresy, but at great cost. In its effort to present divine unity to the world, it became ever more practiced at hiding its contradictions. Historians believe that under Pope Innocent XI, elected in the year 1676, a unique balance was struck between external reform and internal suppression. He was a pope celebrated for his austerity and crackdown on financial corruption. But austerity is not the same as purity, and beneath the marble of his reforms ran a current of cruelty hidden behind sacrament. The inner Vatican, especially the private apartments and sublevel vaults, became increasingly inaccessible. Maps of the Apostolic Palace were redrawn and redacted. New doors were carved where none had been before, and others, especially those leading downward, were sealed without record. Workers reportedly heard voices echoing from chambers thought empty, and in a rare letter preserved in the Biblioteca Casanatense, a stonecutter named Cesare D'Angelo wrote of passages too narrow for men, but echoing with the sound of weeping. See, the center of this dark geometry was Cardinal Benedetto Cassini, a cleric whose rise had been as rapid as it was unexamined. Born in Siena to a family with obscure origins, Cassini had been taken into clerical training as a boy, showing early signs of theological brilliance. But in private correspondence later archived by inquisitors, several contemporaries described his particular fondness for the innocence of youth. No formal charges were ever made. Instead, he was promoted to the position of papal confessor and eventually granted control over several interior sections of the Vatican complex, including those below the library and choir school. It is within these substructures that the shadows deepen. According to research by church historian Dr. Lucia Ferretti, several boys of unknown parentage were brought into the Vatican between 1678 and 1684. Their names do not appear in census records or church registries, but their presence is suggested in other ways. Receipts for deliveries of linens and food in unaccounted quantities, chamber pot inventories that do not match the number of reported staff, and most chillingly, the surviving journal of a Carmelite monk named Matteo Ferrante. Ferrante's journal, discovered behind a false wall in a condemned monastery near Bologna, details a 3-month stay in the Vatican during a period of illness. Assigned to assist in the kitchens, he recorded being ordered to prepare private meals for the silver-belted ones, a phrase he never understood but repeated often. He wrote of hearing scratching behind locked wooden panels, and of a small figure in white seen fleeing when the wrong door was open. He was transferred the following week, never to return. Some experts, including Vatican archivist Paolo Bertoni, believe the silver-belted ones were young boys chosen for their appearance and docility, traits not uncommon among choir pages, altar boys, and orphaned novices. But these were not ordinary boys. According to Bertoni, they were removed from regular chapel service and placed under private supervision within a section of the Vatican no longer accessible today. What happened in those sealed corridors cannot be proven with the certainty of court transcripts or legal confessions. But the fragments that remain, confiscated correspondence, damaged floor plans, and anonymous accusations, form a picture too coherent to dismiss, a picture of ritual cloaked in sanctity and predation dressed as divine right. The boys, historians suspect, were not formally inducted into religious life. They were not given robes or tonsures. They bore no titles, had no assigned confessors, and received no education beyond what was required for performance and obedience. Several letters recovered from the suppressed archives of the Holy Office described them as adornments to papal solitude, living icons of innocence kept for private spiritual reflection. Their selection was a matter of visual harmony. Surviving eyewitness accounts, mostly from dismissed servants or later denunciations, speak of slender frames, clear skin, and large eyes. Many were taken from rural parishes in southern Italy and northern Spain, where poor families sent their sons to church orphanages in the hope they would become priests. Instead, they were filtered through a silent network of clerics who knew which features to look for and how to frame the invitation. According to the records of Bishop Gaspard de Rouen, who visited Rome in 1686 and later wrote a confidential report to the French crown, he was quietly warned not to ask too many questions about the boy who fetched his water during a private meeting. The child had bruises beneath his sleeves and would not speak. The bishop's diary entry, archived in Paris, notes simply, "The Holy City has its own logic. The boy was beautiful and broken." The chambers beneath the Vatican library were not dungeons in the traditional sense. They were not made for punishment. The walls were smooth, the bedding fresh, the icons polished and carefully arranged. But this is what made them more sinister. These were rooms designed to maintain the illusion of spiritual purpose. The boys were not chained. They were, in many cases, praised. They were given gifts, food, praise, tokens of supposed divine favor. And yet, they were not free to leave. Their silence was mandatory, and their presence was conditional on obedience. It is here that the role of Pope Innocent XI becomes more difficult to define. Officially, he was a reformer, critical of moral laxity, opposed to nepotism, and remembered for his resistance to the extravagant courts of Catholic monarchs. But the scope of any papal reform stops where willful blindness begins. Some historians argue that Innocent XI could not have been unaware. The restructuring of sub-Vatican levels, the disappearances of certain altar boys, the whispered resignations of junior priests, these are not details that escape a man trained in the intricacies of power. More damning is the fact that in 1688, when rumors of improper conduct reached the Jesuit general in Rome, the investigation was not expanded, but immediately quashed. Letters sent to the Dominican inquisitors were recalled, testimonies were burned, and the one cleric who dared to speak too openly, Brother Luigi Montano, was found drowned in the Tiber with his hands bound in his own scapular. The use of silence as a mechanism of control is not unique to this chapter of Vatican history, but rarely has it been so complete. The boys' names were erased, their faces remain unrecorded. No funerals were held, no masses said in their memory. Yet the spaces they once occupied continued to be cleaned and maintained well into the 18th century. Architectural records from 1723 show routine expenditures for a lower passage no longer marked on public plans. And in the handwritten notes of an Austrian envoy, preserved in the state archives of Vienna, there is a sketch of what appears to be an underground cell with a high-graded window and a small brass crucifix mounted beside a child-sized cot. If true, it would mean the practice persisted for at least 30 years after the initial reports surfaced. By the early years of the 18th century, a quiet dismantling had begun. Not a reckoning, there was never an admission of guilt, but a measured retreat from exposure. The Vatican, ever attuned to the shifting winds of European politics and Enlightenment inquiry, began sealing doors, quite literally. Masonry receipts from the year 1702 detail the bricking up of 4 corridors beneath the Apostolic Palace. Officially, these were hazardous due to structural instability, yet the work was performed in secret, at night, and without the involvement of the usual engineering clerics. The names of the workers were expunged from payroll ledgers. Those who labored beneath the marble halls were likely sworn to silence or replaced altogether. Cardinal Cassini, by then an old man with trembling hands and a failing memory, was removed from public duties and relocated to a quiet convent in the Umbrian Hills. He died within the year. No eulogy was read at his funeral. His name does not appear in the Vatican's Book of Saints or the Martyrologium, but neither was he condemned. In Rome, silence is sometimes the highest form of protection. The boys disappeared entirely. No records indicate what became of them. Some historians, like Angelo Martinelli, believe a few may have been quietly reassigned to distant monasteries under new names, with strict vows of silence. Others were likely buried within the Vatican grounds, unblessed, unremembered. The small mass graves near the old papal stables, long believed to contain plague victims, have recently come under renewed scrutiny. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in 2017 revealed multiple child-sized skeletons layered between mid-17th and early 18th century strata, many exhibiting signs of malnutrition and blunt trauma. Officially, the Vatican denies all connection. One of the few surviving accounts of the aftermath comes from an unlikely source, a traveling German musician named Johann Elias Kuhn. In a letter to his brother dated 1709, Kuhn recounted performing in the Vatican during Lent. While rehearsing near the sacristy, he stumbled into a service passage that led him downward. He described a smell of old stone and wax and seeing rows of wooden doors without handles. He heard weeping. When he asked a friar about the passage later, he was told never to mention it again. The letter ends with a chilling phrase: "Not all prayers rise upward." These quiet removals, the vanishing of key figures, the reassignment of monastic records, these were not coincidental. According to Jesuit historian Father Etienne Delacroix, who spent 15 years researching sealed Vatican files before his early death, the Church developed an internal system of archival purging in response to incidents too delicate for open handling. He described a kind of ritual forgetting where facts were not debated but absorbed into controlled silence, layered over by new structures, new chants, new liturgies. By the middle of the 18th century, the chambers had disappeared from all official maps. Choir traditions changed. The Vatican began recruiting older boys from established seminaries rather than from orphanages. Aesthetic standards shifted. Whispers of the silver-belted ones faded into folklore, dismissed as Protestant slander or anti-clerical propaganda. And yet, among archivists and some surviving monastic lines, the phrase still lingers: pueri sine voce, the boys without voices. In the rare instances when the subject surfaced in later centuries, it was dismissed as fiction or as the product of anti-Catholic hysteria during the waves of secular revolution. 19th century historians, particularly those influenced by Romanticism, sanitized Vatican history into narratives of martyrdom and theological triumph. The quiet terror of the 17th century subchambers had no place in the Church's curated self-image, yet certain anomalies refused to vanish entirely. In 1847, a fire in the Jesuit archives of Naples revealed a cache of damaged parchment documents sealed inside a wall. Among them was an unsigned confession written in Latin, attributed to a cleric of the Sacred Household. The document describes in formal, restrained prose the keeping of youthful souls beneath the seat of Peter for purposes of obedience and meditation. It contains a single drawing, a boy kneeling before a crucifix, his arms wrapped tightly around his ribs as if protecting himself. His face is expressionless, his eyes carefully left blank. The Vatican dismissed the document as a forgery, but paleographers confirmed the paper, ink, and handwriting to be consistent with late 17th century ecclesiastical script. To this day, scholars are denied access to most structural records concerning the Vatican's subterranean modifications prior to the year 1750. When asked, officials cite security and sanctity. They argue that disturbing these forgotten spaces risks misinterpretation and unnecessary scandal. But as historian Dr. Claudia Ventresca notes, when a system insists on protecting its secrets more than its children, the silence itself becomes part of the crime. Among the few remaining physical clues is a small, tarnished item cataloged simply as Object 881 Pietas. Held in the Vatican Museum's off-exhibit storage, it is a silver belt with intricate filigree work and child-sized dimensions. Etched into its underside, barely visible, is a single Latin word, servus, meaning the servant. The museum has no acquisition record. It is not on public display. The symbolic power of the belt lies not just in its delicate craftsmanship, but in what it represents, the aestheticization of submission. The boys who wore them, if indeed they did, were made beautiful not for their own sake, but to embody an image of purity defined by others. They were not allowed to speak. They were not allowed to grow. Their very existence was shaped to fulfill a need in others that was spiritual in name, but carnal in action. It is easy to imagine them as victims. Harder, perhaps, to imagine them as children. They may have laughed, whispered prayers, invented secret games in the dark. Some may have come to believe that what was happening to them was holy or at least deserved. In systems of absolute power, suffering often disguises itself as love. This, according to Dr. Marta Grimaldi, is the final violence. Not the physical acts, but the transformation of the soul into something pliable, obedient, and grateful. She calls it spiritual colonization, the total erasure of internal boundaries, so that the abused no longer recognizes their abuse. No formal memorial exists for the boys, no day of remembrance. Their presence in the official annals is less than a footnote, and yet, in whispered traditions passed between archivists and in the haunted glances of older monks who remember being warned away from certain stairwells, their absence is palpable. If there is a lesson to be found in these buried stories, it lies not in shock, but in recognition. What occurred beneath the marble basilicas and golden altars was not the result of individual depravity alone, but of a system built to absorb transgression into ritual. Abuse disguised as devotion, possession masquerading as guidance. The institutional church, for all its grandeur and mystique, proved uniquely capable of turning spiritual symbolism into a mechanism for silencing the small and the vulnerable. In this way, the Vatican's underground chambers were not a deviation from sacred order, but its shadow. They existed not apart from the church's holiness, but within it, beneath it, shaped by the same hands that blessed chalices and sanctified wafers. According to archival theologian Reverend Tomás Delgado, these stories reveal a cruel duality embedded deep within the body of Christendom: the capacity for redemption on the surface and the capacity for erasure beneath it. There is, of course, a temptation to see these events as relics of a barbaric past, aberrations contained by time. But silence, once practiced, does not vanish. It mutates. It reinvents itself in new contexts with different justifications. Across continents and centuries, the Church has continued to face accusations of similar patterns, selecting the vulnerable, isolating them, disguising exploitation as spiritual intimacy, and covering transgressions with layers of ritual and doctrine. Even in the modern age, access to certain Vatican archives remains restricted. The opening of sealed materials related to Pope Innocent XI, scheduled for 2025, has been delayed once again. Officials cite logistical complications. Critics, like former archivist Elisabetta Conti, suspect something else. The story they don't want to tell, she said in an interview before her death, is the one that never really ended. And so we return to the corridors, now silent, now dark. Visitors to the Vatican today walk unknowingly over the sealed thresholds, past the bricked doors that no longer open. Tour guides speak of Michelangelo, Bernini, and papal succession, but never mention the chambers whose blueprints were erased. No monument marks their location. No plaque names the children. But in certain forgotten corners, there are still clues. A stairwell that leads nowhere. A doorway set lower than the others, child height. An unexplained echo when no one else is near. Pilgrims speak of a sudden chill, a sense of being watched. Superstition perhaps, or perhaps something else, an echo of memory, refusing to fade, because something remains, not in relics or stone, but in the questions that refuse to stay buried. Who were they? What did they believe when they closed their eyes each night? What became of the prayers they whispered in silence, thinking someone above might hear? These are the questions that history often leaves behind. Too small, too inconvenient, too damning. But for those who listen in the quiet spaces between marble and myth, the past still speaks. In the centuries that followed, the Vatican's underground remained sealed not just in stone, but in memory. Officially, the Church moved forward, reforming, restructuring, rebranding itself as a bastion of moral authority. But beneath every new doctrine and ceremonial reform was the weight of what had never been acknowledged. The silence surrounding the boys of the 17th century became part of the institution's foundation. A quiet agreement passed from one generation of leadership to the next, that some truths were too costly to speak aloud. Modern scholars who attempt to revisit these chapters encounter not overt denial, but absence. Files unaccounted for, pages missing, accounts that end mid-sentence, inquiries redirected. The Vatican's archives, vast as they are, contain layers of selective visibility. Realities curated not just by what is preserved, but by what is erased. But memory has strange persistence. In 2011, during renovations beneath the Museo Cristiano, workers uncovered a narrow corridor long thought collapsed. The air was stale, the plaster flaked with age. At the end of the hall, behind a partially collapsed wall, they found a single wooden bench and fragments of a child's garment, white linen trimmed with faded gold thread. No human remains were identified. The Vatican issued no public statement. But the workers, according to Italian journalist Silvia Vanucci, were quietly reassigned. No photographs exist. Only descriptions pass quietly between museum staff and contractors. One curator later recalled the silence of the space. It felt, she said, like a place where someone waited too long to be remembered. Perhaps the most haunting part of this story is that we will never know the boys' names. They were selected to be erased, groomed not just for obedience, but for disappearance. They were not martyrs, not saints, not even heretics. They were seen, used, and discarded. Human offerings in service of a sanctity that valued image over life. And yet, the fact that we still speak of them, even in fragment and speculation, is a kind of resistance, a quiet one, but persistent. To remember what others tried to forget is a form of justice. Not the kind that punishes, but the kind that listens, the kind that bears witness. So if this story moved you, share it. Not because it confirms cynicism, but because it honors the truth, however broken, however hidden. And let us know where in the world you're listening from, because the past belongs to all of us. And sometimes the only justice left is remembrance.